All right. The lecture that I'm going to give today has to do with the women in India. I've already spoken to you about this subject in passing. So when we've discussed literacy rates in India, we've compared the literacy rates between men and women. There've been a number of other occasions where we've obviously had occasion to refer to gender, but this is a lecture which is devoted exclusively to the subject of what is the status of women in India today, what role do they play in public life, in political life, what are the issues that affect women in particular. And you know, we want to try to, we have to keep in mind that this is a history course, so that we're not interested in this only as sociologists might. We need to have something of a long-term perspective on this particular question. And what I want to do is I want to begin in the 19th century, because I want to suggest to you why for many countries this remains a pressing question, that is the position of women. So if you look, for example, just so that you begin to understand the larger perspective with which one might want to approach this subject, if you look back to what happened in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks on the United States, you know that the United States shortly after that took a decision that it was going to launch an attack on Afghanistan. And obviously one of the reasons that was advanced for that attack was that Afghanistan was a place where Osama bin Laden was supposed to have been given refuge by the Taliban. But I'm sure that all of you are aware of the fact that one of the principal justifications later on for the continued American involvement in Afghanistan was the argument that women in Afghanistan were being suppressed by the Taliban, right? And that the West or Western civilization had an obligation to improve the position of these women. Of course, in the abstract, you could say that could be an argument for intervention almost anywhere in the world, because in most countries of the world, one could argue that the position of women is not equivalent to the position of men. There isn't the kind of equality that we might desire. But of course, the case of Afghanistan was considered to be spectacularly different in the sense that here women were supposed to be ruthlessly oppressed by men, that the system of patriarchy was so well entrenched that you had such anomalies that is from the point of view of the West, as 10-year-old girls being married to 60-year-old men, for example. So this was the kind of argument that was widely prevalent. Right? Now, what we want to do is we want to try to extract from that some larger, more complex arguments, and this is what takes us back to the 19th century, because my first argument that I want to submit to you is that in the early part of the 19th century, and remember that India is under colonial rule at this point in time, right? And the question that you remember that many nationalists were beginning to ask themselves, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, was why is it that India has always been under foreign rule? Now, in the early part of the 19th century, when India is firmly under colonial rule, it became imperative for the colonial state to start to intervene in the internal affairs of Indian society. And when I say internal affairs, I mean principally by that such things as the status of women. So if you think that women are being oppressed in India, and you have come there as a colonial power, and what is one of the principal justifications of the colonial power? What was called the civilizing mission, that we have a mission to civilize these people who are backwards, and that means that effectively, in practical terms, it means that we have to do whatever we can to improve the position of women in Indian society. Right? So in the early 19th century, if I can now put it in a different language, the argument became well established that the way you judge a civilization is by how it treats its women. So essentially they set up an evaluative scale. This is what I'm calling the civilizational evaluative scale. And if you're trying to understand what I mean by that, just think, for example, of contemporary times. What is the evaluative scale that we use today? So we go to something like the United Nations Development Report, and the United Nations Development Report, you know what it does, right? The Human Development Report. It basically ranks countries according to how advanced they are, right? And what does it mean to be advanced? So you look at such things as, well, what is the rate of literacy in that country? What is the maternal mortality rate? Of course, the lower the maternal mortality rate, the more advanced the country is. What is the infant mortality rate? What are the number of hospital beds for every 10,000 people in the population? Right? What are the number of doctors for every 10,000 people in the population? What percentage of the population has access to drinking water, to potable water? What access of the population percentage of the population has access to electricity? So forth and so on. Right? These are the measures that you use today. Now, in the early 19th century, the foremost measure was, how does this country treat its women? And of course, there is a kind of a paradox and irony at work here, because frankly, you could ask yourself, by what right did the West set up this evaluative scale? Because frankly, in the early part of the 19th century, no country treated its women too well. I mean, if you look at England, it was completely uncommon for girls to get education in early 19th century England. The idea that girls might get educated was frankly unheard of at that point in time. And it would be very difficult to argue that women in England in the early 19th century had social equality. But nonetheless, Western powers, including England, were firmly persuaded that however bad the position of women in Britain, the position of women in countries like India was much worse. And what they did was they pointed to various kinds of things, which they said, well, indicate what the status of women is. Right? So what would these things be? For example, the practice of sati. So what is sati? Sati is practice of widow immolation. That when a man dies and he's a married man, then his wife is going to jump into the funeral pyre, because remember, among Hindus the body is cremated, right? It's burnt. Right? So, and if you have an open air cremation, you know, the husband's body has been laid on the funeral pyre, then the woman is supposed to burn herself to death. Now, of course, you have to understand, by the way, that it's not that the practice of sati was widespread in India, not even remotely. So for example, in the year, let's say 1815, 1820, let's take a random year like that, because we're going to find that sati is going to be actually abolished by the British in 1829. So we're taking, let's say, a year of 10 or 15 years before the abolition of sati, and we have official statistics on how many satis were committed, because there were parliamentary committees that were appointed to investigate this matter. And each district official was asked to submit reports of whether there was a sati that had taken place under his jurisdiction. And what we're talking about is something in the neighborhood of 700 to 1,000 satis in India, for example, in the year 1815 or 1820. Right? So we're not talking about a phenomenon that was mass scale prevalent all over India. In fact, it was confined to a certain part of India. In this case, we're talking about eastern India, the place, what is called Bengal. Right? But nonetheless, from the point of view, and I think that there is an argument to be made that one sati is too many. Right? You could make that argument and therefore say that the numbers is not the most conclusive measure here. The fact of the matter is that you have a practice which the British find to be abhorrent, and what they want to do is they want to put an end to this practice. Now, what might be some of the other practices by which you judge this civilization and say that this civilization does not treat its women fairly? Right? That it, in fact, engages in gross abuse of its women. So the other practices might be restrictions on widow remarriage. That if a woman gets widowed, there are restrictions on whether she can remarry or not. Now, if the woman were 70 years old, well, you might say, well, you know, that's a different matter. But what if she were a young girl of 10 years old? Because, in fact, in certain communities, child marriages were not unknown. Right? And the general practice in some of the upper caste communities was that you got a girl married off before she had achieved the age of puberty. She would continue to stay with her birth parents, with her natal parents, and then once she had achieved puberty, then she would actually go to her husband's home. Right? But she might have been married off at the age of 5 or 10. It's possible. And again, we're not saying that this is a practice that was widespread to be found all over India across all caste communities. It's more prevalent in some communities than it is in other communities. Right? So if a girl gets married off at the age of 10 and she's not even consummated her marriage, that is that she's had no sexual relations with her husband at all, because at this point she's still staying actually in her parents' home, and then suddenly she gets the news that her husband, her child husband, if I may put it this way, has died of a snake bite or cholera or influenza. Right? Well, she's a widow now. And in a certain upper caste community, she may not be permitted to remarry. So and then of course there are phenomena which would affect even a wider range of the population, and that would include such things as access to education. What was the access that girls, women had to education? And certainly in the early part of the 19th century, we would have to say that the access to education was very minimal. Right? So now what we're saying is this, that let me put out the main argument in an analytical fashion, that the idea was that you judge a civilization by how it evaluates, how it treats its women, and India was found to be sorely wanting in this respect. It was found to be sorely deficient in this respect. Right? So this is going to be the beginning of what we might describe as social reform movements, because in the second half of the 19th century, when Indian nationalism starts to become a slightly more potent force, Indian nationalists are themselves going to take charge of this matter, because the argument is going to be, well, it's for us to decide how we are going to treat our women, and the colonial state has shamed us now because it has made us aware of the fact that our women are not being treated properly. So what we need to do is we need to now encourage social reform movements. And here again I'm speaking, remember, of undivided India, what would today include Pakistan and Bangladesh and all of that. So in the second half of the 19th century, you begin to see what are called these women social reform movements. And these women's social reform movements were dedicated to a number of things, such as, for example, increasing the access to education for girls and women, decreasing female infanticide, because female infanticide, again, was practiced in certain communities. The idea being that if a girl was born, that she was a liability. Why is she a liability? So, for example, if you have to pay a dowry for her, she's not productive. Okay? So female infanticide was not entirely uncommon in the 19th century. And one of these things that the women's social reform movements would seek to do is to obviously eliminate that. Now, in many cases, what you had was a public debate. One of the most interesting public debates is what is called the debate over the age of consent bill. What is the age of consent bill in the second half of the 19th century, moving now into the early part of the 20th century? The age of consent bill is a bill that is introduced before the Indian Legislative Assembly, which stipulates that a girl must be of a certain age before she can be considered to be rational enough to have given her consent to marriage. So that an Indian family cannot say of a 12-year-old girl that she consented to her marriage to a 14-year-old boy. The age of consent bill said the girl has to be at least 16 years old before she can be considered to have given her consent to the marriage. So that now the consequences are that if a girl is married off at the age of 12 or 14, and if this bill becomes law, her parents have in fact actually violated the law by having her married off before she was 16 years old. The boy had to give his consent too, so there was a minimum age of consent for a boy. Usually it's going to be a year older, okay? So that's one of the controversies that becomes a major controversy in the late 19th century, moving into the early 20th century, the age of consent bill. So what have I established so far? What I've established is that that if we want to look at the position of women in India today, and we want to consider what are some of the social reform movements of our times which affect the status of women in particular, we have to go back effectively to the 19th century to understand the origin of some of these movements, and then we go to the second half of the 19th century, moving into the early part of the 20th century to see what were some of the women's social reform movements concerned about, right? So we have talked about widow remarriage, access to education, elimination of female infanticide, the controversy over the age of consent. One could add, obviously, a number of other things as well, right? Elimination of child marriage is related to the age of consent bill. Now, in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, as all of you are aware, we haven't discussed this at length because that falls outside the purview of our course, but it forms a backdrop. But nonetheless, as all of you are aware, in the first half of the 20th century, what you have is a major nationalist movement, right? And the principal political party is the Indian National Congress Party, which is de facto, not actually by law, as it were, but de facto, the person who is really running the party, if I may put it this way, or certainly the principal architect of the Indian independence movement is of course Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Now, one of the things that we have to take note of is the fact that because Gandhi was heavily invested in the idea of nonviolence, this facilitated the entry of women into the public sphere. And this point cannot be emphasized enough. I mean, one of the things that struck me 2-3 decades ago when I first started reading the autobiographies of educated women written in the 1920s and 1930s was to what extent all of them acknowledged the fact that it was the movement for independence led by Gandhi using nonviolent means which made it possible for them to enter into the public sphere. And when I say for them to enter into the public sphere, what I mean by that is women taking part in demonstrations, for example, being out, right, protesting along with the men. And this was, of course, critical because you have to remember that many of these, for example, many of these upper class women who wrote these autobiographies, I mean, these women very often came from conservative families where they had led a very sheltered life. And now for them to be out in the public was in fact a radical departure from the kind of upbringing that they'd had. But one of the reasons why their parents were willing to let their daughters go out into the public domain was partly because this movement was a nonviolent movement, and of course it was under the leadership of Gandhi, who by this point, rightly or wrongly, and we're not here to assess that, but rightly or wrongly had already acquired a halo as a saint. So the idea was that, well, if women are going out into the public sphere, they're going out for a good cause. And they're under the leadership of a person who is now recognized to be a world historical figure. And of course, within the Indian independence movement, and if we did a detailed analysis, we would talk about some of the politics of gender in the Indian independence movement. But within the Indian independence movement, there is no question that there are certain things that were considered to be more appropriately the domain of women. So the picketing of liquor shops. See, one of the things that many of these demonstrations and protests did were they would picket a liquor shop. The idea was to try to show to the owners of these liquor shops that the kind of business you're engaging in is in fact not a productive business. It's harmful for the community. And why should women in particular be asked to picket these liquor shops? Because the idea was that women are the ones who are most adversely affected when their men become drunkards. Right? So the picketing of liquor shops was a task that was delegated largely to women. And some feminists who obviously have analyzed this have said that, well, you know, it shows that the Indian independence movement itself was quite gendered in various respects. And I think that that argument obviously has a considerable degree of merit. But the totality of the picture is what you need to look at, and what the totality of the picture that we're looking at is that it was a movement that was largely non-violent. There were segments of it that resorted to violence, and there were women who took part in armed movements as well. But that's a very, very small percentage of the women who were involved in politics in India in the 1920s and 30s and the 1940s. The vast majority of women who were involved in politics were involved in what can be characterized as the non-violent movement that was led largely by Gandhi and his associates. Right? And so what this does is this now puts women into the public sphere. They're out in the public sphere, they're out on the streets, they're part of the Congress Party. We know that there are a number of women who held very key positions in the Congress Party. Sarojini Naidu is probably one of the most well-known them, and she actually is going to become the president of the Indian National Congress Party at one point. Right? So this is what now takes us to 1947 and the aftermath. That's the backdrop, and that's the long-term historical picture that I think that you need to keep in mind. Now, in 1947, when India wins independence, and as has been mentioned countless number of times in this class, you know that there is a constitution that is going to be adopted. a couple of years later, and the Constitution offers universal franchise. That is, that everyone, regardless of gender, regardless of caste, has one vote. One person, one vote. Right? And you have to keep in mind again that in 1949-50, the idea of universal franchise was not widely accepted in the world. There were very few countries which actually allowed women to vote in 1949-50. Right? So this is the beginning of a different phase of politics that we need to think about, particularly women's politics in India and the role of women. Now, looking at this period, what I want to do is I want to sort of alert you to a number of considerations. Many of these considerations are raised by Amartya Sen and John Dress and their reading that you have, right? But I want to just lay out a few facts, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take up the rest of my class time to discuss a couple of important cases. One of the cases that I want to discuss, which is mentioned at some length in the Wendy Singer book that you have, is what is called the Shah Bano case. I want to look at that. And I want to look at the whole problem of dowry deaths, which I have mentioned in this class at some length, but I want to discuss it in slightly greater detail and a bit more nuance on this particular occasion. But let me first lay out a few general considerations. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. These three countries are among a handful of countries in the world, only a handful of countries which have a deficit of women. Okay, and when I say deficit of women, what I mean is that the female-male ratio in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh adversely affects women. And let's look at it in a slightly longer historical perspective, and immediately come up with a question which I don't think has been really resolved. Okay, but before we get to that question, here is the data that you need to think about. In 1901. And here are census figures. This is the census of India, so these are the most reliable figures that we have. In 1901, there were 972 women for every 1,000 men. Or I should say 972 females for every 1,000 males. Okay? So that's the ratio that we're talking about. And again, keep in mind that in most countries of the world today, and historically speaking, over the course of the 20th century, women or females outnumber males. Marginally so, but they outnumber them. So if you look at the United States, if you look at Australia, you look at Japan, countries like that, you're going to find that there are going to be approximately 1,003, 1,005, 1,010 females for every 1,000 males. But there are a handful of countries, many of them in South Asia, where in fact the ratios are extremely different, where there are fewer girls, fewer females than males. So 972 to 1,000 and 1901, this had declined by 1981 to 935 females for every 1,000 males. Okay, that's a huge decline. And so for those of you who have done this week's reading, right, you've read the article by Amartya Sen, 100 million women are missing, whatever that article is called. But that's what he's referring to. Where did all these females disappear? Okay, where did they all disappear? And there are various answers to that, because what we're talking about is neglect of female children. So some of what we're also talking about is the abortion of female fetuses. So there was this hospital, I think I might have mentioned this particular anecdote, I don't recall, this particular hospital in Bombay, which is a hospital for the wealthy. It's an expensive hospital. Just Lok Hospital, and at this hospital they found, when they did a study, this is a group of feminists who did a study, I think the study goes back to about 20-25 years ago, they found that 50,000 fetuses were aborted at this hospital. Not a single fetus that was aborted was a male fetus. Not a single one. All were female. Okay, so this is of course what you can refer to as a form of female murder, effectively. Okay, and then of course you're talking about female children in infancy. So the child is born, the female child is neglected. So if there happen to be 4 children in the family has insufficient food supplies, the likelihood is that the boys will be fed first before the girls are fed. And if this pattern continues over a long period of time, then obviously you're talking about female children dying because of malnutrition. Right? So if we started to parse the data that we have even for today, when we say that 50% of the population of India is suffering from malnutrition, then we might find that female malnutrition is a much greater problem than male malnutrition, which is not to undermine male malnutrition. Anyone suffering from malnutrition, that's a problem. But we're saying that even here the statistics might be skewed. And it was very common, by the way, very common to find ads of the following sort. Spend 500 rupees now and save 50,000 rupees later. You know what this means, right? And this would be in the hospital, right? It became illegal subsequently to do that. What did it mean? Basically the ad said, spend 500 rupees now and save 50,000 rupees later. Spend 500 rupees and get an abortion. If you know, get a test done, the amniocentesis test, because when you get that test done, then you know whether the fetus is female or male. And if it's female, that's what the test costs, have it aborted. And then save 50,000 rupees later on. Why? I mean, this is a random figure, because you can expect that that's what you're going to have to shell out for your daughter's dowry when she gets married. Right? So this is the scenario that we're talking about. And here's the question, that if the rates of literacy for women have gone up, which they have, right? So let's say 1947 to 1981. Remember the statistic I gave you for 1901, 972 females for every 1,000 males. 1981, 935 females. By 1991, this figure had gone down to less than 930. The latest census is encouraging because it shows that now the ratio is starting to go up just a notch. So in 2014 figures, based on the 2011 figures, there are 940 females for every 1,000 males now. So from 930, it's now gone up slowly to 940. But here's the question, that if women were getting educated in large numbers, comparatively speaking, we know that India still has a substantial portion of the population that is not educated. The literacy rates are not what they are in the industrialized countries of the North or in Cuba or Nicaragua. Right? But nonetheless, we do know that the rates have gone up substantially, and that obviously in some states such as Kerala, women have a literacy rate of 98, 99%. And then there are districts of Rajasthan, districts of MP, where the female literacy rate for Dalit lower caste women might be 10%, might be 5%. Shockingly low. But keep in mind the generality of the situation. The generality of the situation is that the literacy rates went up substantially. So for women, let's say from 20% to over 58, 60% today. Now, if the literacy rates went up, women got more educated, we became, in other words, more modern and progressive, how does one explain the decline of the female-male ratio? Right? And this is a question that Sen and Dres do not answer. They do not answer. Because they do not answer partly because they are writing from an extremely liberal perspective. And you know that one of the sacred cows for liberalism is the view that education will resolve every problem in life. Right? Now what we are saying is that it did not resolve this problem. Or we are saying that, well, the education that people got was not adequate, or it was insufficient, or it was skewed in some respects. That maybe people got more educated in India, and as they got more educated, they also lost some of their traditional values. Because then we'd have to ask, is it the case that it was traditional values that at least enabled India to retain a female-male ratio of 972 to 1,000? Bad as that was, at least it was 970 plus. And that as India becomes more educated in the 20th century, we start to see, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, we begin to see that, in fact, this ratio has declined. So the argument here is not that education is bad for women. Of course not. The argument simply, the question simply here is, how would we begin to understand this problem? Yes, Mohammed?
How do you explain the increase again?
Oh, but that's very recent. Now we'd have to see whether this trend holds up. We don't know that. Because remember, the trend for going down held up over several decades, right? Several decades. Now whether this trend of it going up slowly, which is very, very recent.
We're in the 21st century now.
Sorry?
We're in the 21st century, things are getting slightly better.
We don't know. We don't know. I'm just saying that the trend of it going up is too short to be able to make some kind of decisive, inference from that. On the other hand, the trend of it going down was a trend that can be seen over several decades, over a century, if I may put it this way. And therefore, that entitles us to ask the question, why is it that if education went up, literacy rates went up, people became more conscious of women's rights? We haven't even spoken of that. Wouldn't you say that the 20th century, so let's supposing you had to do a history of the 20th century globally, and you said, well, what are some of the most important developments in the 20th century? I think there's no question that the idea of women's rights would have to be seen as one of the major developments of the 20th century. So if there was an advance in our thinking about all of this, how is it that the value of girls continue to decline? Because you can only say that the value attached to girls' lives continue to decrease throughout the 20th century in India, and shockingly, it decreased overwhelmingly in affluent, highly educated communities. And that is why I gave you the illustration of that hospital in Bombay, because that's a wealthy hospital. The poor do not go there. It is the rich who went there. Right? So this is an interesting problem that we have to think about. Okay? So female-male ratio, but again, and it's not possible for us to look at every index that Sen and Dres, that's what they do. Maternal mortality, infant mortality, child mortality under 5, so forth and so on. I mean, one could go through all of that and then begin to try to unravel the picture in its complexity. I think there was a question back there. Yeah?
Yes. So one of the main factors contributing to the decline of women would be dowry that the family had to pay.
No, I don't know that that would be one of the main that would be a illustration of the decline. Okay, that would be an illustration that we could say that there was and I talked about dowry in this class before, right? That that throughout the second half of the 20th century, the demand for dowry went up, and this showed the declining value attached to the lives of women. Okay, you could say that, but you couldn't say that that's going to account for everything there. That's an illustration of a problem. Right? So we would, in order to attack the problem, which I would be happy to do that, but then we'd have to have 3 separate classes, because I have my own idea of what are some of the problems with modernity, because you would need a critique of modernity. Right? That there are certain kinds of modernity which in fact might be inhospitable to women. Okay? That we assume that as we become more modern, that modernity and its institutions are always hospitable to women. And it's not clear to me that that's the case. All right? So, but one has to nuance this very carefully, because, for example, under modernity, women go out into the public sphere. Now, when they go out into the public sphere, there are certain hazards. Now, this doesn't mean that women should not go into the public sphere. Let's be very clear about that. But let's recognize that what modernity does is it introduces not just new opportunities for women and new advantages for women, it also introduces new liabilities and hazards for women. And that is why I gave you an illustration. Some of you might remember this illustration from 2 lectures or 4 lectures ago, and that was these call centers, right? Where, when business is outsourced to India, so you've got an AT&T or Verizon account, and you need to call to figure out some problem. Your call goes to India, and a person, and it's midnight over there, they're picking up the phone. Well, most of these people who are working at these call centers are now women. Right? And that's the illustration I'd given you. And what happens when they finish their shift at 4 a.m.? Well, it introduces all kinds of social problems in that society. Because now you've got a woman out at 4 a.m., and if a woman is out at 4 a.m., in a traditional society, that meant only one thing, that she was basically a sex worker. But here we're not talking about a sex worker. We're talking about a woman with a legitimate profession. It's just that she finishes work at 4 a.m. and obviously who's responsible for her safety and security at this point in time? Because you could say there's a litmus test. I don't think any society in the world can pass that litmus test. And that litmus test of equality would be if a woman could walk out at 4 a.m. in any society, anywhere in the world, dressed in any fashion that she wants and not be molested, then you could say, yeah, we have complete equality. I don't think there is a country in the world that can meet that litmus test at this point in time, frankly. Okay? But there are obviously countries that are much worse off than others in that respect. So now what we're saying is that this problem, I'm simply laying it before you, and I'm saying that the readings do not actually help us understand how one would account for something like the decline in the female-male ratio as education, literacy, access to various opportunities for women continues to grow. Okay? Now, there are other interesting questions, such as what is the role of women in the labor force? Okay, and again, I've spoken about that, but let me just condense it very briefly once again, because that Aman Sethi book that you read, the cast of characters there is largely male. You know, there is one or two important women there, but the cast of characters is largely male. It's largely male because if you're a reporter and you're trying to understand the unorganized labor sector and you're a male reporter, you have more access to men than you do to women. Now in India, less than 20% of adult women are part of the labor force. That's quite small. Okay? It's quite small compared to China, it's small compared to Germany, to the United States, to all of these countries. Right? And we do know that the majority of women actually belong to the unorganized sector. I've discussed the unorganized sector for you. So this means that this is a labor that is largely paid for in wages. The compensation would be in wages. It might be in kind. So when I say it might be in kind, what I mean by that is if a maid is working at a home, right, part of her compensation is the fact that she's got a roof over her head for 24 hours a day and that she's got 3 meals a day. If she's working for a wealthy family as a 24-hour live-in maid, so the family that's giving her wages, they might say that it's like tips in America, if I may put it this way, right? That's why waiters and waitresses are, which is not true in Europe, but here, of course, their wages are abysmally low because the idea is you're getting compensation through the tips, right? So this is what I mean by compensation in kind. It could include food, include clothes, shelter, so forth and so on. But women largely belong to the unorganized sector. However, it is important to keep in mind, and I think I concluded my last lecture by was beginning to talk about that there are women who are represented obviously in certain sectors in disproportionately large numbers. So for example, the teaching profession is highly feminized in India as it is in the United States, particularly at the lower levels. When you get to elementary school teaching, primary school, secondary school, highly feminized. Working in libraries, again, largely women. Airline offices. Lots of visitors to India who go there, they've noticed that, well, when you go to an airline office, you need to get your ticket changed. You go to Air India, Air France, whatever the case might be, largely, if not entirely, staffed by women. Right? So there are obviously women who are in white-collar jobs as well, and obviously at universities. And I want to show you a couple of slides before I continue my discussion. I want to begin with this. I don't know if anybody here keeps up with the news in India at all. So actually, this even made it to today's New York Times, an incident that happened in India yesterday. And in India, it's gone, as I say, viral on YouTube completely. These are two young women, they're sisters. They got into the news yesterday. Nobody knew about their existence 36 hours ago or 48 hours ago. And they've been dubbed Sisters of Steel, by the way. That's the epithet that has been attached to them. One is 22, one is 19. They were traveling on a bus in this town called Rohtak. Rohtak is one of these towns that you really don't want to be in, frankly, if I may put it this way, because there's nothing going on there, number one. and whatever is going on tends to be a bit unpleasant. All right, and I'm sure that people in Rohtak will say that that's a big stereotype, but yeah, this is a problem with these smaller towns where things are quite unregulated. So, of course, the same problem can happen in Delhi. In fact, in Delhi it might be much worse, except that there are other opportunities in Delhi as well. Right, so they were traveling on a bus. This is about 36 hours ago. And a couple of guys boarded the bus and started basically passing lewd remarks and making obscene gestures. And the bus has about 20-25 passengers. There are 8 men seated in the bus. None of them lifted a finger to try to say that, well, you guys should restrain yourself. This is not the way that you behave towards women, etc., etc. Right? Nothing of that kind happened. And the reason this made the news is that these 2 young girls, they were wearing jeans, and one of them actually took off the belt and started belting this guy. Right? I mean, so you can see it in the video. Just go to YouTube. Don't do it right now. Just go to YouTube. Okay? I know there's always a temptation. Everybody, minute you mention something, somebody will immediately go online. Do it later on. She takes off her belt and she actually whips this guy. Okay, and now, and these guys, they must have been absolutely shell-shocked because they never expected such a reaction. And now these 2 young girls have become famous. They've actually been told that India observes what's called a Republic Day parade. So this is on 26th January of every year. There's really nothing comparable to it in the US, but the analogy, which is not really a good analogy, would be something like the State of the Union address, which is, of course, something given by the president. And then, if you have ever watched a State of the Union address, there are always 3 or 4 people, an official, a military officer who died, and his widow is there, and she'll be felicitated because he did great heroic acts, that kind of thing, right? Well, that's what they do at the Republic Day parade. So these women have now been invited to the Republic Day parade, which is presided over by the President of India. And they're going to be felicitated for their great courage. Right? Now, this, of course, is an everyday incident. And that's what's being discussed in the media, is that, well, it's not that what's happened, it's not that the molesting of women is exceptional. What is exceptional here is the fact that these 2 women, neither of whom comes from an upper-class affluent family, right? They come from a, what you might describe as a kind of a lower middle-class family. That seems to be the background that they come from a small town that one would not see as a place of enlightenment necessarily, but nonetheless, they had extremely progressive values, and in fact, they made a number of other remarks. So they said that, Indian politicians are used to lecturing girls about how they should behave. Maybe they should lecture boys on how they should behave, right? And so they were actually quite candid about this. And I think that this is what struck everybody. So this incident, as I said, is actually even mentioned in the New York Times today. Now, I just want to move to a couple of other slides, because what we're doing is we're now branching out into the larger question of women in the public domain. And what are, as I said, some of the questions that one might come up with. So this is a photograph. I don't know if anybody recognizes what's happening here, because we want to look at the other side for a moment. These are Indian women scientists. So when India, a couple of months ago, did a successful mission to Mars, right? These are women scientists who work at ISRO. So ISRO is an acronym, and it's the equivalent of NASA in terms of the kind of organization it is, at least officially. Indian Space Research Organization. That's what the acronym stands for. So these are women scientists at ISRO. This is a photograph, either this one or something very close to it, that was also published in the New York Times. And what immediately struck every observer of Indian society was the fact that the preponderant number of people here, at least the ones who are visible in the forefront, are all women, right? Because, of course, the overwhelming impression of India is of a society where women are relegated to the back seat. We've already talked about female-male ratio. We've talked about dowry debts. We've talked about, the molestation of women in public sphere. But then, of course, you have to reconcile yourself to something like this. And one of the questions I get asked constantly, I mean, I get queries, from high school students who are doing a project on history, and the constant question, the one inevitable question is, well, how come India has had a female prime minister, but women are still so backwards? How come, of course you could say, well, how come Pakistan and how come Bangladesh? All of them have had women who were head of the state, something that's not happened in the United States. So does that suddenly make India more progressive? Of course not. Not even remotely. And then the Western historian and sociologists, they have a pat reply, which is not very satisfactory either, frankly. Their pat reply is that women are able to rise to the highest level in politics in India for two reasons. One, because they happen almost invariably to come from a well-connected political family. So their husband was a prime minister, for example, and the husband dies, so she inherits the office, or the son was in politics, or the father was in politics, and the argument being that, well, this is, the pattern in South Asian politics. Well, I think, frankly, it's a pattern in American politics, too. I'm not going to go through the list of women in American politics, beginning with Hillary Clinton, okay, whose spouses or brothers or sons or fathers or whatever have been important people in politics. Okay? But this is a pat reply that your Western historian sociologist has. The other argument would be, well, in India very often they elevate women to the status of the goddess. Okay, and so this is one of those instances where, well, she became the goddess. Indira Gandhi was a prime minister of India, for 15 some years, and she's been elevated to the status of a goddess. No, I think that there may be all kinds of reasons why women might, in fact, actually, for the same reason that women, for example, might be quite important in science. And I think there's no question that proportionately, there are more women, proportionately, okay, more women in science and mathematics and engineering in India than there are in the United States. I think there's just no question about it at all. Because here, these professions are highly masculinized, which is not really the case, certainly not to that degree, in India. Okay? And it's not, and again, I mean, it's important to understand that. So, for example, an illustration I would want to give you, just so that you can place it in context again, is Iran, where the software industry is completely dominated by women, completely dominated. I mean, if you just read the figures, you're going to be astounded by the degree to which women, in fact, actually are the predominant workers in the software industry in a country like Iran. Okay? So we'd have to keep something like this in mind when we begin to look at women in India. What we're saying is that, well, there's certainly situations that seem to be rather anomalous. Okay, why is it that women can rise to the top in politics and yet on the whole have rights which are certainly not equivalent to the rights that men have, that they do not have the kind of space in the public sphere that men might have, right? But this is not to say that they don't have any space in the public sphere. So this is a photograph which was taken in 2011. In November 2011, it's a part of these women are part of a huge protest of workers. Okay, so it's a Mazdoor Sabha. That's the Mazdoor is a laborer. So these are women who largely come from working class backgrounds, and they're taken part in a very large protest. Over 100,000 women. As in many cities around the world, there are certain places where people congregate for protests, right? So in Delhi, for example, there's a place called Jantar Mantar, and that's where women will very often, or men, groups that want to protest will gather together. So this demonstration took place in 2011, and in this one here, what you see is Women's Solidarity Day protests in Delhi. This is 2013. And this again is from 2013. So this is Women's Solidarity Day protest, but this is in the state of Rajasthan in Western India. And this here is an interesting picture. This is the last slide that I'm going to show you for today, and then move back to a discussion. So the slogan that you see there, it's the same slogan in both of the placards. Nari ka apman band karo, band karo. Nari ka apman means the insult to women, stop the insult to women, stop the injuries to women. Okay, a man is to offend, Okay, and the context for this, and this, by the way, Tarun Tejpal is a name of a man who was the editor until quite recently of India's most well-known investigative news magazine, and he was he's extremely well respected. In fact, a few days before he was arrested on charges of sexual harassment, he was actually spending the evening with Robert De Niro, right? So he's someone who moves around in big circles, right? That's what we're really talking about. Anyhow, so he was caught in an act of sexual harassment and had to resign his position and was hauled off to jail, and so these women are actually holding a placard, which you don't see the rest of it here in this photograph, but basically accusing him of being something like a rapist. All right, and the context for this demonstration was the gang rape of a young woman on a moving bus in the city of Delhi in 2012, which again ignited the whole nation. But these things, they ignite people for a while, and then after a while, unfortunately, things return back to where they were. That's typically what happens with many of these kinds of events and demonstrations. But in any case, this was a really brutal attack on this young woman. She actually died of her wounds eventually. She was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. It happened, by the way, in a fairly affluent neighborhood, about a 1.5 minute walk from where I stay in Delhi. Okay, so I know this neighborhood really, really well. Right? And you had demonstrations that took place all over Delhi. You had candlelight vigils, so forth and so on. This is the context, okay, for this demonstration that you're seeing here. But what you're seeing here and all these images is obviously moving women. This one here, women who are obviously part of the public sphere. Okay, now to try to make us understand some of the nuances and some of the complexities, I want to look at two phenomena in particular. Okay, so I want to look at dowry deaths, and I want to look at what is called the Shah Bano case. Let me begin with the Shah Bano case, and let's go through it a little systematically so you can begin to see some of the issues that are brought up by this case. So this is a legal case, and this legal case goes back to 1985. Shah Bano refers to a woman from the city of Indore in Madhya Pradesh. So this is central India. Central India. You don't need to worry about where she is from here, really. If you were to do a detailed study, it would be important only because Indore has certain kinds of historical connections. But we are interested in the general problems raised by this case. So she was 62 years old when she'd been married for a Muslim woman. This is a Muslim woman. She'd been married for a number of decades, and she had 5 children from her husband. In the second decade of her wedding, her husband took a second wife. Muslim men may have 4 wives, according to Muslim personal law in India. Okay, so that would not be considered polygamy or bigamy and would not be a criminal offense. And it's important to add, by the way, that this is, that the Hindu nationalists will always say, oh, Muslim men can have 4 wives. Well, yeah, they might legally be entitled to have 4 wives, but that doesn't mean that all of them do. And in fact, as very often many Muslim men have argued, they can't support even 1 wife, much less 4 wives, given the kind of incomes that they have. Okay? But it's important to keep this in mind because this is a rampant stereotype that Muslims have multiple wives, and of course if they have multiple wives, this means that they have hordes of children, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 from each wife, right? That's a stereotype that becomes rampant in a way. And even when people know that to be not the case, they will certainly instrumentalize this fact as they see it, this so-called fact. Okay. Now in this case, as I said, she's married to a man who's a lawyer. His name is Muhammad Akram Khan. reasonably well-to-do lawyer. She's been married to, Shah Bano has been married to him in the second decade of their wedding. The man takes a second wife who lives in the same house. But finally, many years later into the marriage, he decides to throw her out of the house. And her children, her 5 children, so he says, you've got to leave the house. He throws them out. Now, in Muslim weddings, there is a sum of money that is set aside. It's called meher. I discussed this when I was discussing dowry. Okay? It's not the same as dowry at all, but I was discussing it in connection with the dowry. So this is called meher. Meher can be viewed simply as a maintenance. So for example, when you have a nikah is wedding, Muslim nikah, at the wedding, before the wedding is finally solemnized, the Maulvi will say, kitna meher? How much meher? What is the amount of money that has been set aside by the groom's family, by the husband's family, and this is the money due to her in the event of a separation. Okay? So that's what we're really talking about, and what we're saying is that this woman, when she's thrown out of the house, she feels that she's entitled to a certain maintenance, that is an allowance, monthly allowance, that would enable her to feed herself and her 5 children. Right? So she goes to, but now before we get into the intricacies of the case, let me remind you of something which is crucial, which is that Muslims and Christians and other religious minorities are not subject to the same laws as the rest of the country, that is Hindus. In civil matters, not in criminal matters, in civil matters. So when I say civil matters, what am I talking about? I'm talking about divorce, marriage, adoption, property inheritance, so forth and so on. These are civil matters. Muslims are subject to what is called Muslim personal law. And Christians are subject to a Christian personal law. In criminal matters, this does not apply. So if a person commits a murder, doesn't matter whether the person who commits a murder is a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian, that person is subject to the same laws as anybody else. Okay? Because those are matters of criminal jurisdiction. In matters of civil jurisdiction, the laws that apply to Muslims are different, and particularly in the matters that are most sensitive to any community. What are the matters that are most sensitive? If you ask Mormons in this country, what is the matter that is most sensitive to you? Obviously, it would have to do with personal matters, such as whether a Mormon can take several wives or not. Okay, so forth and so on. Property, inheritance, marriage, divorce, separation, adoption, etc., etc. Now, that's the context. So when Shah Bano was thrown out of her house by her husband, who had taken a second younger wife some years ago, this woman, Shah Bano, what did she do? She went to the local court and she said, this man is refusing to pay me a maintenance allowance. So the court ruled that she has to be paid a certain maintenance allowance. She set the figure, the judge set the figure at a pittance. I mean, it was a pittance. It was like a nominal sum of money, okay, just to indicate to her that, well, we recognize that you have a legitimate grievance, but, you know, the reason probably why the judge set a maintenance at a very low amount is that he knew that in principle that he cannot rule on this matter. Why cannot he not rule on this matter? Because this is a matter that comes under Muslim personal law. It cannot go to a civil court, right? And so what would a Muslim woman do? She would actually have to go to a board which adjudicates Muslim personal law, right? And that board would be comprised, of course, entirely of Muslims. That's what she would have to do. But she went to a court, a civil court, and the judge ruled in her favor. And then what did she do? She appealed to the higher court of the state of Madhya Pradesh, where the judge endorsed the decision of the lower court, increased that amount. At that point in time, I'm cutting out some of the finer details. You can read about them in the book that you have. At that point, Mr. Khan, that is Shah Bano's husband, by the way, at this point he has not he has not divorced her. He's just thrown her out of the house. They're not divorced yet. So he issues a talaq. A talaq is a divorce announcement. Right? So he says, I give you talaq, I give you talaq. He's divorced her, so the divorce is now final. And what does he do? He goes to the Supreme Court of India and says to the Supreme Court of India that the Madhya Pradesh High Court, the state High Court, had no jurisdiction in this matter. This is a matter solely having to do with Muslim personal law. This is a matter between one Muslim and another Muslim. A civil court has no jurisdiction in this matter. Right? That's what he wanted the Supreme Court to rule on. So he actually appeals to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of India decides to hear the case. And what the Supreme Court did was they actually ruled that she was entitled to maintenance. Right? So they endorsed the decision of the lower courts, including the decision of the Supreme Court. And in fact, the Supreme Court made in its decision, said very clearly that, quote, and I quote here, a common civil code. So common civil code means that the law pertaining to marriages, divorce, all of these civil matters will be common to every citizen of this country. Doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim or a Hindu, Christian, Jew, Parsi, Buddhist, whatever the case might be, right? So the court ruled a common civil code will help the cause of national integration by removing disparate loyalties, that is, varying loyalties in laws which have conflicting ideologies. Right? It will help the cause of national integration, that if we want to be one country, we need to have a common civil code. That's what the Supreme Court did. Now, this is where it gets complicated, because if it had stopped there, you would have said, well, the Supreme Court was progressive. The Supreme Court rules, right? And that's what you expect courts to do. You expect courts to obviously show some sense of justice and equality, right? Which is why the Supreme Court is the highest law of the land in every country that has something comparable to it, including the United States, right? Because you expect that judges are going to reflect not simply on the matters of law, but they're going to reflect on the matter and say that, well, you know, there is a certain element of injustice in this. This woman has been thrown out of the house. She's got no protection. She's got 5 kids. Who's going to take care of her, right? If her ex-husband doesn't, and she's not employed, because as was quite common in such marriages, the woman did not work. And she has no employable skills either, by the way, okay? And so the court is, in a sense, taking stock of all of these considerations, and the court makes a decision saying that her ex-husband is now required to give her a monthly sum, and they stipulate what that sum is going to be for the rest of her life. Now, what did the Indian government do? Why did the Indian government want to get involved in this matter at all? That's the first question. It's very simple, the answer. If you wanted to begin with the simplest explanation, you would say that, well, this is a storm brewing in a teacup now. The reason for that, obviously, is that the Muslims are going to go up in a storm. And they're going to say, you are interfering in our community's internal affairs. And of course, that's exactly what happened. There were huge demonstrations by various Muslim organizations, orchestrated by various Muslim organizations and communities, including the All India Muslim Law Board, right, which basically has jurisdiction over these matters. And what were these Muslim organizations saying? These Muslim organizations were saying, the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction on this matter. Okay? We need to do something about this because this is an infringement of the rights of the community. On the other hand, who do you think would support this decision? What community? The feminists. All the major women's organizations said, this is fantastic. The Supreme Court has now ruled saying that this woman, who has been, in a way, abused by her husband because he's thrown her out of the house and he refuses to give her any money, and the feminist organizations in general said, well, the Supreme Court is standing up for the rights of women. Now, what if you happen to be, so let's take the nexus of that. What if you happen to be a Muslim woman? How would you position yourself on this issue? Right? This is where you can see the intersectionality. Religion is coming in, obviously, right? Class is coming in too, by the way, in various ways. And we know, of course, that gender is coming into the issue in a big way. Right? And then, of course, there are larger questions, and that have to do with the status of Muslims in India as a whole. Were all women's organizations, by the way, did some of them begin to modify their views? We find that a few of them subsequently down the road began to modify their views, because they say that, well, this is always a classic problem where women's rights are advanced, it seems, but they're advanced at the cost of the religious rights of the community, for example. Assuming that you thought that this was a religious right. Some people, of course, thought this was not a religious right, so all the secularists in the country were quite certain in their mind that what India needed was actually a common civil code, and therefore this was a decision that was to be supported. Okay? So you can see that there are different communities are coming into this debate, into this problem, each of them having a point of view that within its own domain seems to be reasonably persuasive. But then you, of course, have to set that view in relation to all other competing views and then decide how you're going to resolve this case. So what did the Indian government do? The Indian government passed a special law saying that this decision of the Supreme Court was invalid, okay, and basically making a special exemption. A special exemption saying that, no, this is a matter that is solely under the jurisdiction of the Muslim Law Board. They will decide, okay, they will decide what is appropriate for a Muslim community, right? So, in effect, I mean, I'm giving you the shorthand version of it. In effect, what this special legislation did was it set aside the decision of the Supreme Court. And you might say, in a sense, it restored the status quo. But of course, it did not completely restore the status quo, because once something like this has been unleashed, obviously there are questions that have come to the fore. People are now beginning to think of things in certain ways. But it restored the status quo only in the sense that it said that, well, no, this woman is not entitled, or, well, that's not the wording. They're not going to say that woman is not entitled to maintenance, but they're simply going to say that the Supreme Court, the civil courts, actually have no jurisdiction over this matter. Our sympathy might be with Shah Bano, but this is a matter to be resolved in the Muslim community. And incidentally, interestingly enough, a few months after this, Shah Bano herself says, I made a mistake. I should not have gone to the courts because this is a matter to be resolved within the Muslim community. And then, of course, it leads to very uncomfortable questions that should communities be coerced or compelled to follow a common civil code, even though because we think that this common civil code is more progressive, because we say that India is a secular country and therefore it is morally obligated to have the same set of laws for everybody. So if that is the case, should we then say that certain communities may be compelled to do certain things which they don't want to do in the interest of maintaining national unity and integration? Right? Those are some of the questions that come up with the Shah Bano case. And it shows you why trying to resolve many of these matters is obviously extraordinarily complicated when you have issues. Here, caste does not really enter into the equation. There are cases where obviously caste will enter into the equation as well. But when religion, gender, class, caste, right, and a number of other considerations, such as, for example, India's status as a secular country, for example, when all of these enter into the mix, how are we going to weigh each of these particular factors? Okay, so that is the Shah Bano case. And I have to say, by the way, that when I say this piece of legislation, so what was this piece of legislation called? Just the name of that piece of legislation is very interesting. It's called the Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Bill. Right? So, but if you look at, why is this piece of legislation that now negates the Supreme Court decision, why is it called Muslim Women Protection of Rights in Divorce? You would say that the rights of these women are being violated. Somebody might say, arguing from a strictly secular standpoint, right? But they're saying her rights are best protected, including the rights attached to the notion of divorce within the Muslim community itself. And what did this piece of legislation do? It, as I said, it exempts Muslims from that particular provision of the law, okay, and it dilutes the real meaning of the Supreme Court decision. That's what this particular piece of legislation is going to do. There was, I think, I can take one question. Yeah.
Yeah, so after this law was passed,
yeah.
she then go to a Muslim court to get her issue, figured out by them?
That's it. She goes back to the Muslim board, but that's another long story. Okay, what happens then and what's her aftermath, you can read up on that. But that's effectively, yeah. Quick question.
Does
Yeah.
the Indian Supreme Court have the power to declare laws constitutional or not?
Oh, of course, yes. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, some countries have what is called a constitutional court. The United States does not have that. United States, the Supreme Court basically rules on whether something is constitutional or not, right? India also does not have a constitutional court. But there are countries, good example, Australia and Malaysia, two countries that I know quite well, which have constitutional courts. And when we say constitutional courts, the jurisdiction of that court is to rule strictly on whether pieces of legislation are congruent with the Constitution and the spirit and the letter of the Constitution or not. That's their mandate, specifically. Okay? The laws here can vary a lot. And since I'm on the subject of Australia, think about it this way too. We've been discussing for a long time in this class, off and on, what makes a country a democracy? I don't know if anyone in this class knows that in Australia, you are required by law to vote. By law to vote in an election. If you do not vote, you can be hauled off to jail and be put in jail. Okay? Right? So, there can be variations in how a country decides to deal with certain things such as, constitutional matters, laws having to do with elections, privileges, duties, so forth and so on. Okay? Now, let me look very briefly at dowry debts. So I have already discussed with you very briefly what we mean by dowry debts. Okay? I want to just quickly mention it again, and then I want to expand the discussion a bit. Well, we don't really have any time. Let me just lay it out very briefly, and then I'll conclude my next lecture right at the beginning with a little discussion of this. I just want you to think about it. So in what we're speaking about when we speak about dowry debts is women who get married, and you find, and usually these are women, by the way, in their late teens to early 30s. Okay, that's basically the range that we're talking about. Majority of them would be in their 20s. Woman gets married, and she's burned to death. But it's passed off as an accident. It's passed off as an accident. And what is that accident? That she was cooking on a stovetop, and her sari caught fire, right? And she got burned to death. Right? That's the little report that you'll find in a newspaper, and you could see these reports appearing frequently in the 1980s, for example, frequently in Indian newspapers. Okay, and why has she been burned to death? Because after she's been married off, the groom's family or husband's family says, "Hey, you didn't bring enough dowry." Remember, what is dowry? Dowry is the goods, the sum of goods. Could include cash, could include various other kinds of. Maybe it includes a country club membership for the very affluent. Okay, right? But it would include various goods in cash and kind that a woman brings with her, which are then appropriated by the groom's family. Okay? And traditionally, by the way, dowry was what a woman brought with her so that she could actually set up a house with her husband. Right? And that's why I think I mentioned to you in this class that, that a typical dowry would include, maybe items of linen, pots and pans. What is it that when you set up house? These are the things that you need to set up a house, right? Flower pots, whatever the case might be, utensils, so forth and so on. And usually there was jewelry. Even in the traditional dowry there would be jewelry, but this jewelry was the domain of the woman. This was in her safekeeping. And very often she would pass on this jewelry to whom? To her daughter, when her daughter got married 25, 30 years later. Okay? So this is the context. Now what we're going to try to understand, I'm going to take 10 minutes in my next lecture, begin with that. We're going to try to understand why did dowry deaths start taking place? And again, if we're becoming more modern and progressive, how come we're having dowry deaths? Okay, and for the next lecture, please make sure you watch that film before you come to class. I sent an email to the entire class. I gave you a link, the URL for that. It's available on YouTube with subtitles, pretty decent print. So make sure you watch the film, and do not read my book until you watch the film. Okay, because you'll really understand the book and some of its nuances better once you watch the film.